Last Lord's Day, we took a look at Genesis chapter 26, the only chapter in the whole book of Genesis that kind of centers on the adult Isaac. And one of the big takeaways from that chapter is what an ordinary man Isaac was. There are, however, some extraordinary principles and truths that also are woven through the narrative of Genesis 26, and we'll look at some of those today on Beyond the Notes. The approach that I took last Sunday on Isaac centered very much on sort of his biographical experience as he navigated the events of Genesis 26. And I think it's a valid way to approach the chapter. That's why I chose it. But one can also sort of zoom out a bit from seeing the events from an experiences of Isaac and what Isaac is feeling and learning, to sort of what are some broader principles and implications one can derive from the narrative of Genesis 26. The narrative breaks down into several sections. There's a famine in the promised land. Isaac is forbidden by God to go to Egypt, so he goes over toward the coast into Philistine territory to acquire food. Ends up in the territory of Abimelech, leader of the Philistines, ends up doing the same thing his father before him did, claiming that his wife is his sister to avoid trouble. Abimelech calls him out for it. And then he ends up moving because his family is so large and his potential power so great, the Philistines ask him to move away a bit. And so he does move away a bit, but he moves into old territory once occupied by Abraham and begins to re-excavate some of the wells that Abraham, his father, had, only to find the Philistines basically claiming every well he excavates. Until eventually the Philistine leadership approaches him to reaffirm an oath of peace between the Philistines and the people of the covenant family, Isaac's growing Hebrew family. Then the chapter ends with just an affirmation that one of Isaac's sons gets into a couple of disappointing marriages. And that's kind of the narrative. We made the point in the message on the Lord's Day that he didn't pray any great prayers, take any great journeys, fight any great battles, achieve any great spiritual milestones, as we would call greatness, especially compared to the larger-than-life lives of the patriarch before him, Abraham, and the patriarch after him, Jacob. And yet in this chapter, I find at least 7 noteworthy additional principles that if I had a second sermon to preach on the chapter, Genesis 26, this would sort of be the highlights of that second sermon. And if Beyond the Notes isn't for that, well, what's it for? The chapter says the first of 7, some important things about faith and obedience to God. God gives Isaac here one direction: don't go to Egypt. And Isaac obeys it. In fact, if Isaac heads for Egypt, the events of the chapter simply don't happen. It takes the narrative in a completely different direction. And so it's worth noting that Isaac obeyed God regarding where he should go in response or not go in response to this famine. And in the immediate wake of that, God reaffirms the Abrahamic covenant to Isaac, which leads to the second observation, God's faithfulness and his blessings. The statement, the first big affirmation of the Abrahamic covenant made in the first paragraph of the chapter, ends in verse 5 with the statement, because Abraham obeyed. Now, you and I were there when the Abrahamic covenant was given in Genesis 12, and it's not conditional. God is not here saying that the Abrahamic covenant will be perpetuated based on Abraham's obedience, which, let's face it, was far from perfect. But just that Abraham did obey. Abraham's faithfulness toward God is being affirmed, and that faithfulness toward God becomes one of God's means to perpetuate the covenant, but not a condition of God's perpetuating the Abrahamic covenant, which is fundamentally unconditional. And here God's faithfulness and the blessing of that covenant extends from Abraham right down to Isaac, as we have been told repeatedly it would. Big takeaway number 3, conflict and resolution. Here in the chapter, Isaac faces multiple potential conflicts. His possible conflict with Abimelech regarding Rebekah, which I can't defend Isaac's overall handling of that scenario, but once Abimelech finds him out, Isaac apologizes in effect and takes the blame because it was his fear that was motivating him. And also the larger conflict in the next paragraph, the central paragraph about those wells. I cited on the Lord's Day the fact that there are people who take the view that Isaac here is being weak, that whenever the Philistines come and bully him out of one of his father's wells, well, Isaac should have stood up to them and flexed his superior military might and told those Philistines a thing or two. But he didn't. He responded instead with meekness. He responded with humility. He responded with the confidence in one who trusts to God's provision, even if in a given moment he's not going to get his way. The high road is always a toll road. Doing the right thing is always, or at least quite often, costly. And I think Isaac demonstrates here that he's learned that, and his conflict resolution or conflict avoidance skills. Look, if you can avoid a conflict by simply giving up what you want, that's often a very good idea. And so conflict and resolution. The fourth principle I see is fear and deception. Isaac, like his father Abraham, deceives others by claiming that his wife is his sister. He's not supposed to do that. Some have said that he learned that from his dad, and you could draw that conclusion until you start looking at the lifespans and the math and the order of things. The fact is, Isaac wasn't born until after the second time his father did that. His father did it once in Genesis 12 with Pharaoh of Egypt. He did it again in Genesis 20 with Abimelech, either the very same person as in this chapter or an earlier Abimelech, depending on lifespans and how things overlap. Abimelech may be a name, but it might be a title. I do not know, and neither do you with certainty. But the last time that happened was in Genesis 20 with Abraham and Abimelech, and Isaac's not born until Genesis 21. So Isaac did not see his father do this, and he did not explicitly learn this maneuver from his father, but he perpetuated it nonetheless. The same reasoning his father applied. Fear-driven deception. When you're afraid, you can do dumb stuff. As your danger avoidance instincts kick in. Trusting God through that which is scary and not taking shortcuts with that which you know to be faithful obedience is tough. Isaac didn't get it all right in this account. Fifth thing, providence and prosperity. Isaac was greatly blessed of God, even though he was in a famine. God's blessings do not depend on external circumstances. Now, God will use external circumstances, but if you've got a job today that you love, that job is not providing your needs. God is providing your needs, and right now, that job's how He's doing it. But the source of our material well-being is not the secondary ways that we're achieving it. It's the living God. And you don't have a 100-fold harvest in a season of famine, but Isaac did. There's something to be said there about God's determination to show blessing and kindness to Isaac, even at a time when external circumstances suggested that it wouldn't be likely. Number 6, inheritance and legacy. Again, the reaffirmation of the covenant underscores the theme of inheritance. Abraham, while he was alive, gave gifts to his other sons, starting with Ishmael, Isaac's older brother, and then with the children and grandchildren that he had after Sarah died. Abraham was a generous man in his life. We talk a lot here at McGregor about joyful generosity, and Abraham really seems to have discovered that. But when all was said and done, and it was down to his estate went in its entirety to Isaac. And Isaac carried on his father's legacy. And remember, that legacy is not just defined at this point by Abraham and Isaac. That legacy is defined by God's grand Abrahamic covenant struck with Abraham all the way back in Genesis 12. And continuing, the Abrahamic covenant is an everlasting covenant. It is an unconditional covenant, and it continues to this day in the offspring of Abraham, who are the followers of Jesus Christ, according to Genesis 3. But at this point, that covenant, in this point in our study of Genesis, that covenant is running on very narrow rails through a certain family of ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, Abraham, Isaac, soon Jacob. And then number 7, hospitality and relationships with others. Abimelech and 2 of his top officials come to see Isaac. And they have not parted under the best of terms. They sent Isaac away, and then they kept having their representatives have run-ins with Isaac around these wells moving around the valley of Gerar. And then they come to see him. And at first, Isaac's response is a little bit defensive. Why have you come? It's not an unexpected response. But as soon as it becomes clear that the desire is to live together in peace, to live together in high regard for one another, to understand each other, Isaac pivots to hospitality, the importance of fostering good relationships with neighbors, even those neighbors that you might have reason to have tension with. It is not a bad thing to demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit, even with people where conflict is possible. Yes, I know later God is going to give some very stern direction to his people regarding how they are to handle the Philistines, but that direction hasn't come yet. And in this season, peaceful accord with neighbors seems to have been the order of the day, and Isaac did it well. Genesis 26, the adult life of Isaac, a demonstration how an ordinary man living his ordinary life with all the emotions and the ups and downs, knowing God and knowing the faithfulness of God, well, his life still demonstrates for us some amazingly important principles. Well, by now, I hope that you are sharing this podcast. I hope you've subscribed. I hope you're telling your friends about it. And as always, we look forward to being with you on the next episode of Beyond the Notes.